FM broadcasting is a method of radio broadcasting that uses frequency modulation, FM, of the radio broadcast carrier wave. Invented in 1933 by American engineer Edwin Armstrong, wideband FM is used worldwide to transmit high-fidelity sound over broadcast radio. FM broadcasting offers higher fidelity, more accurate reproduction of the original program sound than other broadcasting techniques, such as AM broadcasting. It is also less susceptible to common forms of interference, having less static and popping sounds than are often heard on AM. Therefore, FM is used for most broadcasts of music and general audio, in the audio spectrum. FM radio stations use the very high frequency range of radio frequencies. Throughout the world, the FM broadcast band falls within the VHF part of the radio spectrum. Usually 87.5 to 108.0 MHz is used, or some portion of it, with few exceptions. In the former Soviet republics, and some former Eastern Bloc countries, the older 65.8 to 74 MHz band is also used. Assigned frequencies are at intervals of 30 kHz. This band, sometimes referred to as the OIRT band, is slowly phased out. Where the OIRT band is used, the 87.5 to 108.0 MHz band is referred to as the CCIR band. In Japan, the band 76 to 95 MHz is used. In Brazil, until the late 2010s, FM broadcast stations only used the 88 to 108 MHz band, but with the phasing out of analog television, the 76 to 88 MHz band, old band channels 5 and 6 in VHF television, are allocated for old local MW stations who have moved to FM in agreement with Anatel. The frequency of an FM broadcast station, more strictly its assigned nominal center frequency, is usually a multiple of 100 kHz. In most of South Korea, the Americas, the Philippines, and the Caribbean, only odd multiples are used. Some other countries follow this plan because of the import of vehicles, principally from the United States, with radios that can only tune to these frequencies. In some parts of Europe, Greenland, and Africa, only even multiples are used. In the United Kingdom, both odd and even are used. In Italy, multiples of 50 kHz are used. In most countries the maximum permitted frequency error of the unmodulated carrier is specified, which typically should be within 2 kHz of the assigned frequency. There are other unusual and obsolete FM broadcasting standards in some countries, with non-standard spacings of 1, 10, 30, 74, 500, and 300 kHz. To minimize inter-channel interference, stations operating from the same or nearby transmitter sites tend to keep to at least a 500 kHz frequency separation even when closer frequency spacing is technically permitted. The ITU publishes protection ratio graphs, which give the minimum spacing between frequencies based on their relative strengths. Only broadcast stations with large enough geographic separations between their coverage areas can operate on close frequencies. Frequency modulation or FM is a form of modulation which conveys information by varying the frequency of a carrier wave. The older amplitude modulation or AM varies the amplitude of the carrier, with its frequency remaining constant. With FM, frequency deviation from the assigned carrier frequency at any instant is directly proportional to the amplitude of the audio input signal, determining the instantaneous frequency of the transmitted signal. Because transmitted FM signals use significantly more bandwidth than AM signals, this form of modulation is commonly used with the higher, VHF or UHF, frequencies used by TV, the FM broadcast band, and land mobile radio systems. The output power of an FM broadcasting transmitter is one of the parameters that governs how far a transmission will cover. The other important parameters are the height of the transmitting antenna and the antenna gain. Transmitter powers should be carefully chosen so that the required area is covered without causing interference to other stations further away. Practical transmitter powers range from a few milliwatts to 80 kilowatts. As transmitter powers increase above a few kilowatts, the operating costs become high and only viable for large stations. The efficiency of larger transmitters is now better than 70%, AC power into RF power out, for FM-only transmission. This compares to 50% before high-efficiency switch-mode power supplies and LDMOS amplifiers were used. Efficiency drops dramatically if any digital HD radio service is added. VHF radio waves usually do not travel far beyond the visual horizon, so reception distances for FM stations are typically limited to 30 to 40 miles, 50 to 60 kilometers. They can also be blocked by hills and to a lesser extent by buildings. Individuals with more sensitive receivers or specialized antenna systems, or who are located in areas with more favorable topography, may be able to receive useful FM broadcast signals at considerably greater distances. The first radio station to broadcast in FM in Brazil was Radio Imprensa, which began broadcasting in Rio de Janeiro in 1955, on the 102.1 MHz frequency, founded by businesswoman Ana Kauri. Due to the high import costs of FM radio receivers, transmissions were carried out in circuit closed to businesses and stores, which played ambient music offered by radio. Until 1976, Radio Imprensa was the only station operating in FM in Brazil. From the second half of the 1970s onwards, FM radio stations began to become popular in Brazil, causing AM radio to gradually lose popularity. In 2021, the Brazilian Ministry of Communications expanded the FM radio band from 87.5 to 108.0 MHz to 76.1 to 108.0 MHz to enable the migration of AM radio stations in Brazilian capitals and large cities. Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and particularly Germany were among the first countries to adopt FM on a widespread scale. Among the reasons for this were: the medium wave band in Western Europe became overcrowded after World War II, mainly due to the best available medium wave frequencies used at high power levels by the Allied occupation forces, both for broadcasting entertainment to their troops and for broadcasting Cold War propaganda across the Iron Curtain. After World War II, broadcasting frequencies were reorganized and reallocated by delegates of the victorious countries in the Copenhagen Frequency Plan. German broadcasters were left with only 2 remaining AM frequencies and were forced to look to FM for expansion. Public service broadcasters in Ireland and Australia were far slower at adopting FM radio than those in either North America or continental Europe. Radio broadcasting is the broadcasting of audio, sound, sometimes with related metadata, by radio waves to radio receivers belonging to a public audience. In terrestrial radio broadcasting, the radio waves are broadcast by a land-based radio station, while in satellite radio the radio waves are broadcast by a satellite in Earth orbit. To receive the content, the listener must have a broadcast radio receiver, radio. Stations are often affiliated with a radio network that provides content in a common radio format, either in broadcast syndication or simulcast, or both. Radio stations broadcast with several different types of modulation. AM radio stations transmit in AM, amplitude modulation. FM radio stations transmit in FM, frequency modulation, which are older analog audio standards, while newer digital radio stations transmit in several digital audio standards, DAB, digital audio broadcasting, HD radio, DRM, digital radio mondiale. Television broadcasting is a separate service that also uses radio frequencies to broadcast television, video. Broadcasting by radio takes several forms. These include AM and FM stations. There are several subtypes, namely commercial broadcasting, non-commercial educational, NCE, public broadcasting and non-profit varieties, as well as community radio, student-run campus radio stations, and hospital radio stations can be found throughout the world. Many stations broadcast on shortwave bands using AM technology that can be received over thousands of miles, especially at night. For example, the BBC, VOA, VOR, and Deutsche Welle have transmitted via shortwave to Africa and Asia. These broadcasts are very sensitive to atmospheric conditions and solar activity. Nielsen Audio, formerly known as Arbitron, the United States-based company that reports on radio audiences, defines a radio station as a government-licensed AM or FM station, an HD radio, primary or multicast, station, an internet stream of an existing government-licensed station, one of the satellite radio channels from XM satellite radio or Sirius satellite radio, or, potentially, a station that is not government-licensed. AM stations were the earliest broadcasting stations to be developed. AM refers to amplitude modulation, a mode of broadcasting radio waves by varying the amplitude of the carrier signal in response to the amplitude of the signal to be transmitted. The medium wave band is used worldwide for AM broadcasting. Europe also uses the long wave band. In response to the growing popularity of FM stereo radio stations in the late 1980s and early 1990s, some North American stations began broadcasting in AM stereo, though this never gained popularity and very few receivers were ever sold. The signal is subject to interference from electrical storms, lightning, and other electromagnetic interference, EMI. One advantage of AM radio signal is that it can be detected, turned into sound, with simple equipment. If a signal is strong enough, not even a power source is needed. Building an unpowered crystal radio receiver was a common childhood project in the early decades of AM broadcasting. AM broadcasts occur on North American airwaves in the medium wave frequency range of 525 to 1705 kHz, known as the standard broadcast band. The band was expanded in the 1990s by adding 9 channels from 1605 to 1705 kHz. Channels are spaced every 10 kHz in the Americas, and generally every 9 kHz everywhere else. AM transmissions cannot be ionospheric propagated during the day due to strong absorption in the D layer of the ionosphere. In a crowded channel environment, this means that the power of regional channels which share a frequency must be reduced at night or directionally beamed in order to avoid interference, which reduces the potential nighttime audience. Some stations have frequencies unshared with other stations in North America. These are called clear channel stations. Many of them can be heard across much of the country at night. During the night, absorption largely disappears and permits signals to travel to much more distant locations via ionospheric reflections. However, fading of the signal can be severe at night. AM radio transmitters can transmit audio frequencies up to 15 kHz, now limited to 10 kHz in the US due to FCC rules designed to reduce interference, but most receivers are only capable of reproducing frequencies up to 5 kHz or less. At the time that AM broadcasting began in the 1920s, this provided adequate fidelity for existing microphones, 78 RPM recordings, and loudspeakers. The fidelity of sound equipment subsequently improved considerably, but the receivers did not. Reducing the bandwidth of the receivers reduces the cost of manufacturing and makes them less prone to interference. AM stations are never assigned adjacent channels in the same service area. This prevents the sideband power generated by two stations from interfering with each other. Bob Carver created an AM stereo tuner employing notch filtering that demonstrated that an AM broadcast can meet or exceed the 15 kHz baseband bandwidth allotted to FM stations without objectionable interference. After several years, the tuner was discontinued. Bob Carver had left the company and the Carver Corporation later cut the number of models produced before discontinuing production completely. As well as on the medium wave bands, amplitude modulation, AM, is also used on the shortwave and long-wave bands. Shortwave is used largely for national broadcasters, international propaganda, or religious broadcasting organizations. Shortwave transmissions can have international or intercontinental range depending on atmospheric conditions. Longwave AM broadcasting occurs in Europe, Asia, and Africa. The ground wave propagation at these frequencies is little affected by daily changes in the ionosphere, so broadcasters need not reduce power at night to avoid interference with other transmitters. FM refers to frequency modulation, and occurs on VHF airwaves in the frequency range of 88 to 108 MHz everywhere except Japan and Russia. Russia, like the former Soviet Union, uses 65.9 to 74 MHz frequencies in addition to the world standard. Japan uses the 76 to 90 MHz frequency band. Edwin Armstrong invented wideband FM radio in the early 1930s to overcome the problem of radio frequency interference, RFI, which plagued AM radio reception. At the same time, greater fidelity was made possible by spacing stations further apart in the radio frequency spectrum. Instead of 10 kHz apart, as on the AM band in the US, FM channels are 200 kHz 0.2 MHz apart. In other countries, greater spacing is sometimes mandatory, such as in New Zealand, which uses 700 kHz spacing, previously 800 kHz. The improved fidelity made available was far in advance of the audio equipment of the 1940s, but wide interchannel spacing was chosen to take advantage of the noise-suppressing feature of wideband FM. Bandwidth of 200 kHz is not needed to accommodate an audio signal. 20 kHz to 30 kHz is all that is necessary for a narrowband FM signal. The 200 kHz bandwidth allowed room for plus or minus 75 kHz signal deviation from the assigned frequency, plus guard bands to reduce or eliminate adjacent channel interference. The larger bandwidth allows for broadcasting a 15 kHz bandwidth audio signal plus a 38 kHz stereo subcarrier, a piggyback signal that rides on the main signal. Additional unused capacity is used by some broadcasters to transmit utility functions such as background music for public areas, GPS auxiliary signals, or financial market data. The AM radio problem of interference at night was addressed in a different way. At the time FM was set up, the available frequencies were far higher in the spectrum than those used for AM radio, by a factor of approximately 100. Using these frequencies meant that even at far higher power, the range of a given FM signal was much shorter, thus its market was more local than for AM radio. The reception range at night is the same as in the daytime. All FM broadcast transmissions are line of sight, and ionospheric bounce is not viable. The much larger bandwidths, compared to AM and SSB, are more susceptible to phase dispersion. Propagation speeds are fastest in the ionosphere at the lowest sideband frequency. The Ciel-Rite difference between the highest and lowest sidebands is quite apparent to the listener. Such distortion occurs up to frequencies of approximately 50 MHz. Higher frequencies do not reflect from the ionosphere, nor from storm clouds. Moon reflections have been used in some experiments, but require impractical power levels. The original FM radio service in the US was the Yankee Network, located in New England. Regular FM broadcasting began in 1939 but did not pose a significant threat to the AM broadcasting industry. It required purchase of a special receiver. The frequencies used, 42 to 50 MHz, were not those used today. The change to the current frequencies, 88 to 108 MHz, began after the end of World War II and was to some extent imposed by AM broadcasters as an attempt to cripple what was by now realized to be a potentially serious threat. FM radio on the new band had to begin from the ground floor. As a commercial venture, it remained a little-used audio enthusiasts' medium until the 1960s. The more prosperous AM stations, or their owners, acquired FM licenses and often broadcast the same programming on the FM station as on the AM station, simulcasting. The FCC limited this practice in the 1960s. By the 1980s, since almost all new radios included both AM and FM tuners, FM became the dominant medium, especially in cities. Because of its greater range, AM remained more common in rural environments. Thank you for watching this video.